Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So last week I talked about the rise of vigilantism because cities are becoming progressive hives of scum and villainy. Well, I guess that's kind of redundant. But anyway, because of this, I think you're going to see at the very least a rise in the support for the idea of vigilantes, certainly within North America, because we have a history of that, and that's what my video was about last week. But that led me to the question of, do we really need cities anymore to begin with? Because the backdrop of the city is one of the major, if not the major, backdrop for stories about heroes in the 20th century. Certainly, what I cover and talk about a lot of, which is superhero comic books, that is your backdrop. It is the city. And so I want to look at that question today and talk about the necessity or the no longer necessity of the city within our lives, and therefore within stories, and therefore as a backdrop to heroes. And speaking of which, if you want some true heroic stories, you might want to click on one of those links in the description or the pinned comment for my 3 graphic novels. I have 2 superhero graphic novels and 1 low fantasy sword and sorcery book. You're looking at some of the spectacular art for those books in the background. As I said, they're stories about heroism, centered around themes like death and honor. So if any of that sounds or looks appealing to you at all, click on one of those links in the description or the pinned comment and go on over and check out my graphic novels. But back to my topic, a discussion of whether or not we still need cities within our stories. And when I say our, I'm just saying generally, culturally, does it really matter to have a familiar city setting within the background anymore? Well, first off, let's look at this historically and acknowledge the fact that this rise of the city as the backdrop for many heroic stories is a product of the 20th century. The 19th century was earmarked, we're talking North America here, sorry for everybody else, but that's what I'm talking about, concentrating on North America. But the major stories within the 19th century were Westerns. Certainly stories that I'm talking about which have a main focus of a hero. One of the mainstays, if not the major go-to for such stories within North America was the cowboy story, was a Western story. And certainly that continued on into the 20th century, right up until about the 1970s. There were Western stories. It took a long time for those stories to die out. But the point was, within the 19th century, within North America, those were the stories that people gravitated towards. Why? Because stories, in part, as I always say, is a product of what people need, what people are missing in their lives and what they need. Certainly with a heroic story, and if we go back to Aristotle, he would say, yes, every story needs a hero because on the whole, people are disgusted by villains. So if you have a villainous protagonist who's actually doing well, they're going to be disgusted by your story on the whole. So you need to have a hero. The point of the story, what the people need out of your hero, is the fact that since a hero is a paragon of virtue, again, going back thousands of years in Western civilization, that's what a hero actually is. This hero is to show the people who are reading these stories, watching these stories, that yes, even though things might be bad, you can see from this paragon that there is the ability to live a heroic, that is to say, a noble and virtuous life within X setting. And that X setting within North America, within the 19th century, was rural. It was a small town. It was the middle of nowhere. The point being that you could show your reader that even in this lawless place, or a place where there wasn't a whole lot of law, there was still the ability, seen through the actions of the hero, to live a noble and virtuous life, which again would inspire the reader, the watcher, whatever. So there would be a connection with your audience that would make it an attractive story. But what the 20th century is known for is the mass migration of people into the cities. If you study history, certainly if you look at it as a story, what is the story of the early 1900s? It is the story of the movement of North American people from the rural into the urban centers. And the latter half of the 19th century is the movement of women from the home into the workplace as well. And again, that workplace, since their husbands were more and more in the cities, would be the city. And so I would attest that this is one of the major, if not the major reason why you had a shift from stories that focused on cowboy heroes to stories of the superhero in nature. Why? Because superheroes almost exclusively had a backdrop of a city. Now, there's an interesting addendum to that in the fact that the two major players within the superhero genre, which would be DC Comics and Marvel Comics, portrayed cities in a much different way. The older versions of the story, which would be DC Comics, picked cities that weren't actually real, whereas the nitty gritty Marvel type stories picked cities which were actually real to bring them more down to earth. But I would say that if you're even familiar in any way with comic culture, you know that Spider Man exists within New York, that Superman comes from Metropolis, Batman, Gotham. And so it is with all the smaller characters as well. Within DC, you have these made up cities like Central City and Star City, where smaller superheroes operate. The history of Marvel has the operating base of the Fantastic Four being New York. Really, most of Marvel is just centered around New York. The Avengers were in New York for a long time. Doctor Strange is based in New York, etc., etc. But the point being, just as with the Westerns, since you had to provide a familiar backdrop to your audience, and your audience was becoming more and more an urban population, and to some extent, the urban center was the new frontier of lawlessness, you had to show the people, show the audience, this hero, that yes, even within this society, this part of society where laws are very hard to enforce, you can still have a hero. That is to say, you can still live a noble and virtuous life even in this context. But my assertion here and now is that that context of the city is no longer needed, and to some extent, no longer wanted. So let's briefly go over the reasons of why that is. Well, first of all, we have to acknowledge why the massive influx of people within the 1900s was to the city to begin with. Well, it was because of an influx of new technologies and new forms of production, which drove employment into city rural centers, and so the people went where the jobs were. And we also have to acknowledge that I'm not entirely sure of the exact date of this, but I know it was sometime within the last 20 years. But for the first time in human history, there were more people living in cities than in the countryside. But that all being acknowledged, as a student of history, I would see the reverse of all of that happening within the next 100 years. And we've already taken the first steps in that direction. And funny enough, you would think that the back to the land movement, where people would become more rural, more rooted, would be something that would be spurred on by a conservative mindset. I would say if it was left alone, that would happen eventually. But what we had was a great shift to get this snowball rolling down the hill from who? From your progressives, from your Democrats within the years of 2020 to 2022. Why? How? Well, because they used 2020 to 2022 to basically cut off their nose to spite their face. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that they used this very specific instance of locking people in their houses in order to, at the very least, help them win an election. And I do mean at the very least, but I'll leave that there. But the point is that in doing so, they broke the back of the reason for cities. And they shot themselves in the foot because the cities are the concentrated areas of quote unquote progressive support. But really, for a lot of people, they took 2 years and found out that, yeah, if I can do almost anything remotely, why in the world do I need to be in the city? Now I realize that many people have abused their privilege of working from home, and it has started to go back towards, yeah, you got to come into the office. But still, it has shown people that that is actually possible. And I think you're going to get more and more people who are not employees, that is, say, who abuse that privilege, but people who actually are, let's say, small business owners, or at the very least, medium business owners who need to count every penny and therefore will make things work much better in this direction, and they will make things remote. They will say, we don't need to pay the rents of being in the city anymore. I can just build this business in a small town, in a little village, in the middle of nowhere. It doesn't matter. If I can do this job in New York while I'm physically in, I don't know, outer Mongolia, but I have a good Wi-Fi signal, then that's all I need. And personally, I have some experience with this. Why? Because I set up and ran a business. And I was doing that back in, at the very least, 2010, probably 2005. I started to turn everything paperless. Things slowly and slowly went digital. And then all of a sudden it was like, yeah, we don't need anybody in that location anymore. just do it from your home. So by the time 2020 rolled around, I had absolutely no problem. I didn't follow any of these ridiculous rules, but I had absolutely no problem running my business, or actually the people who run my business now, from the locations of where they were. Same with my publishing of comics right now. I live in the middle of nowhere, but I exchange email with people around the globe almost daily, getting art done, having editing done, inkers, letterers, etc. So if you take that as the tipping point of people saying, I don't need the city anymore, and then you add to that my redundant phrase of cities have become progressive hives of scum and villainy, yeah, you got a lot of people moving out of the cities. And the thing about cities is they're not based upon a natural resource in any way. Like a small town or a village, or certainly the countryside is. It's not based upon ranchers or farmers or foresters or fishermen or anything like that. The resource, the quote unquote natural resource of the city, is the people. Sure, you might make some exception for certain locations to say their natural resource is their location, they're a port, or they're a stopover between this and that. But really, the central focus of the resources of a city, since it's a concrete jungle, is the people. And if you start to have an exodus of people from the city for these dual reasons that I just gave, number one, you don't have to be there anymore in order to do your job. Number two, people are trying to escape this progressive hellscape. Then you have, again, a snowball that has been tipped down the mountain. Why? Well, again, first of all, we have to acknowledge once again that the reason why people flocked there to begin with was because that's where the work was. If it is no longer seen as that is where the work is or where it is I have to be to do work, then that's a problem. Secondly, you have to realize that since there is no real natural resource there except for the people, there is a massive amount of service industries within cities. That's why they become hubs of culture, because those are service industries. I know in an odd sort of way, but they are. And if you have less people within your city, then you have less demand for those service industries. Therefore, again, snowball goes down the hill, which means you have less need for all of those people in the service industries, and those people start to move out. And once that starts to happen, once you have an exodus of a certain amount of people, you start to get less and less income for the city through its taxes because you don't have as many people, and then you're already, for most cities anyways, stretched thin ability to keep the infrastructure of that city going declines even more because, again, you don't have the money because you don't have the people. Then more and more people will look around them and say, why am I putting up with all of this? Where garbage is piling up in the street, where the trains don't run on time, where the cops don't protect me. Why am I putting up with this? Especially if I can do this job without having to pay the exorbitant fees and rents and amounts for food and everything else of a city. I could be doing it in the countryside. And again, more and more people start to move out. And as I said, I believe that this slow exodus of people from cities is going to be the hallmark of the 21st century. Sure, it's going to take about 100 years, just like the previous exodus to the cities took about 100 years, but it's going in that direction. But let's get back to heroes for a second and talk about the exodus of heroes from the cities. So I'll relate to you very quickly a personal story. I have this friend, and this friend watches Bosch. I'm not even sure where Bosch is actually on. I know you can stream it on the internet somewhere. But anyways, it's a show that's currently on. It's been on for about 7 years. It's a story about a guy who I think for the first 5 years as a cop, and then the last 2 years, including this year, he's a private detective. I'm not entirely sure of the entire story, but it's based upon a book series. It's fairly well written. Last time I talked to Mike Barron, which was on our Wednesday live stream with me and John's Longbox, we talked about Bosch for a minute or two, how he thought this was a really good story, a really good hero, because Bosch's tagline is everybody counts or nobody counts. And I bring up Mike specifically, not only because we talked about Bosch and how he watches the show, he thinks it's a fairly good show, and he's someone who has written novels centered around protagonists who are wanderers who don't actually exist in a city, and at the same time is one of the key figures, key writers in developing the character of the Punisher, which again goes right back to that video I did last week about vigilantes and cities. But again, I talked to Mike. He sees Bosch as being a heroic type figure. I talked to my friend. My friend sees Bosch as being a heroic type figure. And yes, the show was in the background while I was at my friend's house doing this and that. So I do know a little bit about the story, did listen to it. It seemed fairly well written. And although I don't watch very much modern television, I said to myself, do I want to watch this? Maybe I should. But my second thought to that entire thing came swiftly, and it was the following. It was the idea that, no, I don't want to watch it. Why? Because he's a cop. He's a private detective. Where? In Los Angeles. And why should that matter? Well, that matters because, quite honestly, I cannot engage my suspension of disbelief enough to believe that this good guy, who's good at his job and to some extent heroic, can make any dent whatsoever in LA. That just makes zero sense, to the extent that I can't engage my suspension of disbelief for the story. And I'm someone who now, as part of their everyday life, writes superhero and fantasy stories. So again, you have this hero within the story, but since he's in LA, everything he does, everything he says, gets swallowed up eventually, in my mind, because he's in LA, by the progressive hellscape that is LA. So none of it matters. So I can't trust the basic premise of the story in order to enjoy it. Because again, part of the key element of a hero, especially in a lawless place, is the idea that, yes, even though this cowboy, this superhero, lives in a lawless place, they show the audience that you can still live a heroic, that is to say, a noble and virtuous life, even with all of this going on around you. That is to say, they can make some impact. That even though it might be in a small way, it's still an increasing idea that the right will win eventually, that the good will win out. That is the hopeful message of these kinds of stories with heroes in them. But when you put your hero within current day Los Angeles, no, there is no hope there. He lives in a progressive hive of scum and villainy. There's no chance. No chance any of this is going to make any impact. It doesn't matter if he finds the murderer, finds the criminal of one kind or another, and then arrests them. Some DA who wants to get rid of bail or not prosecute people because of, let's say, the color of their skin, or just let people willy-nilly out of jails because they're becoming too full. Yeah, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And you might say, well, at the very least, he's making an impact in the lives of the very specific people that he touches. And again, my thought would go towards, again, it doesn't matter, because these people he might save in this moment, they're just going to be drowned in the sea of progressive villainy in some other way. Their homes are going to be overrun by a riot, or squatters, or homeless decay. They might just, in the next day, get shot by some random drive-by. Or they could start to trust everything and live a normal life just to have their children subvert it into the progressive death cult. So, no, it doesn't matter. And someone might say in the comments, well, what about Gotham? Isn't that the story of Gotham? No, it isn't. And it's partially because Gotham is a fictitious place, but the whole story of Batman is that he's the Dark Knight, not because he's a part of the darkness in the night, but because he is the shining beacon in that night. Just like Superman is a symbol of hope within a hopeful place, Batman is a symbol of hope within a seemingly hopeless place. Hope being the fact that, yes, you believe things can get better. But cities like LA, Chicago, even New York now, do you have any hope for those places? I don't. Is there any indication that the people are going to turn around, see their mistake, and bring these cities back to some kind of sanity? No, they're just doubling, tripling down on the insanity. And again, someone in the comments might be saying, well, isn't that what a hero is supposed to do? They get knocked down and they get back up. Isn't a hopeless city a place where they can do such? And I would say, again, no. There is a point where it just becomes foolishness. Again, heroism is based upon virtue. These heroes are paragons of virtue. And the first virtue is prudence, which is built upon right reason. Right reason being the ability to see reality as it actually is. And if the place around you is a hellscape that's going to slide farther and farther down into hell with no real idea, no real plan of reversing course at all, then yeah, you need to realize that that is reality, and that at some point, you need to shake the dust of that town off of your feet. Again, just look at that idiom itself. It's a Christian idiom. Christianity, which says, How many times do I forgive? 7 times? And by the way, 7 is the perfect number. That's why they chose 7. So do I forgive the perfect amount of times? And the answer was no. You forgive 7 times 70 times. That's one of the principles of Christianity. And yet, there is still a point where if you enter a city and they have no intent of hearing anything that is real, anything that you have to say, you turn around and you shake the dust of it off your feet as you leave. That is the point we have gotten to with cities in North America. And it's certainly, for my money, the point that we've gotten to within heroic stories about North America. For my own stories, yes, I tell stories, superhero stories, that are in the vein of Marvel. They're nitty-gritty type superhero stories, but I tell them in an almost DC world. Why? Because my stories are about wandering heroes, or about cities that don't actually exist. Why? Because it would be useless to have these paragons of virtue exist within these actual cities of North America anymore. Where you have people with superhuman abilities stopping crime because they don't allow muggings or bank robberies, while at the same time you have murderers and, from my own perspective, thinking about the most innocent people within the world, mass murderers and serial killers wandering the street plying their trade. It makes no sense to have superheroes in modern, real cities. It doesn't. And that's why I firmly believe that there is starting to emerge right now, just at the dawn of it, a new type of hero. Just as there was a shift from cowboy heroes out in the wilderness or in a small town to superheroes within a city, we're going to see the development of a new kind of hero that has removed themselves from the city. Because that's what people need. People need inspirational stories to show them that, yes, you can still live even in this lawless country that we live in right now. Because, by the way, a tyrannical law is not a law at all. So you're going to see more and more the emergence of this new type of hero. What exactly this new type of hero is going to look like? Well, we're just going to have to wait and see. Or for my part, we're just going to help build this new type of hero. This hero that is removed from the modern day city. Because the heroes, quote unquote heroes, iconic heroes, though they at one point might have been, that are still in the cities, those heroes, again, going back to comic books, that are still within the cities of New York or the fantastical realms of Metropolis or Gotham, yeah, they're not heroes anymore. They're villains. It's really ironic. We're coming up to, I think it's the 18th of this month, the 18th of April. That is the anniversary for my channel here on YouTube. I've been doing this for 6 years now. One of the very first videos that I did was to cover an interview that was about 2 years old at that point. And I go back to this interview a lot, where the second in command at Marvel at that time was saying that superheroes were the new mythology for North America. She went on then to talk about psychology and how these new mythological figures, these superheroes, needed to be used in a psychological way in order to push, quote unquote, positive ideas. And by positive, she meant progressivism. So for the last 10 to 15 years minimum, the quote-unquote progressive plan was to take over industries that told stories through iconic heroes of American culture, and their plan was to take these iconic heroes to put progressivism in their mouths so that people would then see progressivism as heroic. But quite the opposite has actually occurred. Yes, they did take over these industries. Yes, they did take over these cultural icons of heroes and put progressivism in their mouths. And what happened? Did people see progressivism as heroic? No, they saw these heroes as now being villains. Because there's a reason why progressive cities, which are progressive strongholds, are hives of scum and villainy. Because progressivism is simply the systematized vice of envy. It's not based on the virtue of, I'm looking at my neighbor, seeing how well he does, and I'm going to praise him and try and be like him, so that we both lift each other up towards a higher ideal. No, you look at your neighbor within progressivism and say, this person has something more than me, or can do something more than me. I must tear them down, partly by stealing some of their stuff and giving it to myself, so that we are then equal. And again, this is not just me spouting off nonsense, coming up with things off the top of my head. Again, studying progressivism, I have multiple degrees in political theory, by the way. You look at the definition, and I've done this on my channel, even going back to just the simple Wikipedia definition and following the trail backwards towards what progressivism is, it's based upon the idea of a zero-sum game. In order for one player within this game to get 1 point, he has to take 1 point away from someone else. That is one of the core principles of progressivism. In order for me to move forward, I gotta push you back. And as I said, this is simply the vice of envy, systematized. And if a hero is a paragon of virtue, and the opposite of virtue is a vice, and the paragon of vice is a villain, then what is progressivism? Well, it's the ideology of villainy. And no one wants to see anymore the idolization of villainy. And that's all you're going to get if you set your story in a current day actual city. What people actually want is to be inspired enough to see that no matter how bad things get, I can still live a noble and virtuous life. No matter how bad things get, I can still be a hero. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this, and don't forget, there are 2 links in the description and the pinned comment for my 3 graphic novels, stories about true heroism. You're looking at some of the beautiful art from those in the background, so if any of that looks or sounds appealing to you at all, click on one of those links in the description or the pinned comment, and go on over and order yourself a copy of one of my graphic novels today. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.